This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week, we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
All right. Well, we've got a number of really great questions through Twitter and other social media accounts. So we're excited to kind of dive into them and answer some of those questions. Should we just start from the top?
Yeah. Start from the top and encounter them as we go.
Yeah. Some of them are really interesting. So So there's the first one we broke down into, it's actually three separate questions. Let's break it down into three separate ones. So first part of it is, should a distinction be made between transsexual and trans, the wide umbrella, in practice and law? It's an interesting question because transsexual is an older term that used to be used quite a bit, and then it went out of style. Some people really dislike the use of it these days, but there has been a movement to reclaim that word. So maybe first of all, we should just kind of define what those two words mean. Transsexual used to be kind of the old term for anyone that was doing, like, to use the old language, the sex change, right? It was a very binary. People wanted to change from one sex to the other and live as the opposite sex. And so and back when the system was a lot more careful and there was a lot more assessment, and it was really limited who was allowed to access these treatments. I think that's one of the things that they used to look for too, right? Was, they're looking for, well, how successfully are you going to be able to make this transition? And so it tended to be kind of based on a very, the criticism of it was that unless you wanted to kind of transition into like a heterosexual man or woman, and so it was very limited. So I understand why they wanted to expand that a little bit for there to be some diversity. But in recent years, that word has been brought back, I think, to mean a very binary way of looking at this, right? Like the kind of going back to this idea that I am living my life as the opposite sex. I'm not non-binary.
I think. Oh, just to resume. Yeah. Excuse me. The reuse of the word transsexual, I think, is a reaction to so like the word that became kind of mainstream was transgender, right? Somewhere in the 90s, that time seemed to have replaced the term of transsexual. But then in more recent decade or so, the term transgender has become so vague as to mean pretty much anything. And that's when people started to reclaim the word transsexual to mean this very binary medical notion of transitioning from one sex to another, just to differentiate from the more vague term that transgender had become.
Yeah, because I think, the analysis now is like transgender. I mean, you're right. I think that term was coined in the 90s. It comes out of queer theory, not from the medical treatment of gender dysphoria, whereas transsexual, I think, came out of the medical discourse and literature. But you're right that like transgender can mean so many different things, including a queer theory political movement. And there are people that take on a transgender identity who don't even necessarily have gender dysphoria, but they believe in the political movement based on queer theory and have adopted that term. So it doesn't necessarily even have anything to do with having gender dysphoria and seeking treatment for gender dysphoria.
In a lot of ways, they're kind of counterintuitive states of being or intentions. One is very much within the boundary or the binary and going from one to the other, and the other is more that, like that political idea of queering the binary. And so it's kind of almost seeking to undo the very foundational reason of going from one sex to the other is to say, oh no, both are meaningless, and I'm here to kind of to point out that both are meaningless, or that they're harmful even, is where transgender seems to lie.
Yeah, and some people that are reclaiming the word transsexual are those that have I think this is why I've used it too. Like, I had gender dysphoria and I sought a treatment for gender dysphoria. So to make a distinction, right, between having a condition, treating it, versus having a political stance or political leaning. But I think where this isn't necessarily a straightforward question is not everyone who transitions from one sex to living as the other sex, I wouldn't say necessarily all have gender dysphoria either, even though they maybe are very binary in that change that they're wishing to make. Don't necessarily, it doesn't, that in itself isn't proof that they have gender dysphoria. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I would agree with that. Yes. Yeah.
So it's still a little bit, it's still messy language, right? And it brings us to the question of is there such a thing as a true trans? What does that, what would that mean, right? So it's a seemingly straightforward question, but it can be I think this is a tricky question, because I think at the heart of it is there such a thing as true trans versus those that are maybe transitioning for social or political reasons?
Right. My perspective is there isn't a such thing as a true transsexual. I think obviously there's very severe gender dysphoria and people who drastically benefit from living as the opposite sex in society. It reduces that gender dysphoria. There could be even claims made that certain people are even kind of born with a predisposition. I'm not sure if that somebody can be born with gender dysphoria, but certainly born with a predisposition. Seems to be the case, certainly in like HSTS varieties. But I don't think that means that person is truly transsexual. I think in all cases, transitioning is a choice individuals make. So there are plenty of people who have severe gender dysphoria and do not transition. That person isn't a transsexual. That's just somebody who has dysphoria and has managed it in whatever way they've chosen to, or outgrown it even. So I think that's what lies at the heart of this question is the implication that there is some sort of, true transsexual, and that these people need to be differentiated between people who are transitioning for personal, political, or whatever reasons. So I don't think that there should be a distinction made between the two groups, just because I think it's a false binary, shall we say, between the two.
I think I would agree with you. I think there is true gender dysphoria, and probably more than one type of true gender dysphoria, even if you go kind of back to Blanchard's original typology of two. I think these days we're seeing more than just two types. But if we kind of go back in time, rewind 30, 40 years, when there was really these two primary types of gender dysphoria that we're presenting in clinics, it's arguable whether someone is born with one of those types or both of those types of gender dysphoria. Is there something wired into the mind that makes a person AGP or, I think there is a theory too with the homosexual subtype of gender dysphoria that neurologically, I think it's been kind of disproven that there's a male brain, female brain, but there is a difference between a gay brain and a straight brain. They can see that on scans, and
in generalities,
in generalities, absolutely. And they've been able to differentiate between someone who's AGP and the homosexual subtype of gender dysphoria in brain scans because of that, right? So there's a theory that perhaps whatever it is about that's wired into our brains that makes us attracted to a certain sex. So if they can scan gay brains and see the difference between gay brain and straight brain, there's something neurological there, right? There's something neurological to our sexual orientation.
Yes.
So there is a theory with the homosexual subtype of gender dysphoria that is somehow related to that sexual orientation wiring. That so whether, I don't know if that's caused from being exposed to testosterone in utero or what causes that, but that there may be, if you take that wiring to the next step, it's almost like you're super gay. People resist that language, but I don't mean necessarily literally you're super gay, but in terms of just the neurology of it, that there may be something, if you continue to expose that brain to too much testosterone, it develops a wiring for sexual orientation. There seems to be something extra that kind of gets added to that, to some people, that makes them more gender nonconforming. So there may be a born with it type of gender dysphoria, but I agree with you that doesn't. What I resist is this idea of that automatically makes you a trans person, because that seems like
it's quite homophobic, actually.
It's homophobic, but it's also an over-identification with the condition. It's we've worked so hard with other conditions to say, you're not a schizophrenic. You are a person that has schizophrenia. Right? So we don't have to create an entire identity or a type of personhood out of having a condition.
Yeah.
But I think the intent of the question is probably meaning like those that have gender dysphoria and transition to live the other sex versus that wide umbrella, that wide political umbrella.
Yeah.
I think is what the question's getting at. And we're maybe overcomplicating it a little bit.
Yeah. I guess my fundamental answer to it would be no. Well, yeah, I don't know what. If there could be a distinction made in law, I don't know how that would be done. And I also think that there are certain branches of the quote unquote trans population, the queering the binary type people who might also wish to be distinguished from our type, right? That there's a lot of them who are quite opposed to being, certainly in the female to male transition camp, or female to X transition camp, who are quite opposed to being assumed to be men and being treated in society as men. It's like they very much want to be a trans person. And so I could see that they would actually appreciate a distinction being made between the more binary transsexual camp and their own view of transgenderism. But again, in practice and in law, I don't see how that could be done, I guess.
Yeah, and going back to what I was saying, like I do think there was a time where things were a little bit too limited in terms of like, unless you fit a very narrow stereotype of what it means to be male or female, that they wouldn't really allow you to transition. And so I can understand why we maybe needed to lighten up on that. I mean, why should we be more male? Why should a trans man be more a male stereotype than the average male, right? There's differences there's a range of ways to be male and be female. But it seems like it's gone kind of too far in the opposite extreme. But if what the question is meaning is, should we make any distinction in law between those that have a condition and seek a condition and seek treatment for a condition versus those that are maybe doing it for political reasons? Like, does someone who is trans for political reasons or to, just to fit into a social group, should they be allowed to legally change their sex designation? Is having a certain political view a reason enough to say, okay, well, then we'll allow you to legally change your sex?
Well, I want to say, and this might be controversial, but I want to say no. I don't think. Well, for one, I think that's medical negligence to transition somebody for excuse me, for political reasons or for social kind of I guess socio-political reasons, cultural reasons, if you want to say. Again, it's taken on quite a admission into a club status. Transition has, transitioning as basically the means of admission into a club that is trans, and I think that's incredibly dangerous. And then as far so medically, that's dangerous and just so wrong to enable. And then on a legal standpoint, I think that does really kind of invalidate the distinctions of male and female, certainly in regards to women's spaces, women's single-sex spaces. And so if somebody, can just opt into a female designation on their driver's license for, political reasons, or that's obviously very dangerous for women. But then there's also it does also invalidate, and I don't mean to sound like, my identity is valid, as a transsexual man, I don't want to come at it that way, but I mean, there is, there is the legal fiction that we are allowed for certain, ease of our mental health, right? We can argue the ethics of that, but I think it is still a different designation than somebody who's doing it for political reasons. And so, yes, I think, coming at this two ways is medically, I don't think it's ethical, and legally, I don't think it's ethical either, honestly.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, right? I mean, I know that there are going to be people that don't think that even we should be able to transition and legally change sex. I agree with you that it is a legal fiction that should be reserved for people with severe gender dysphoria who need this treatment in order to function in their life, and our society has kind of granted us permission, right, to do this for our comfort. And we don't often talk as a community about, well, what are our responsibilities? So like, we've been granted this privilege to be able to do this. I mean, people want to turn that into, an entitlement in human rights, but we've been granted permission, to break some of the rules, right? And what is our responsibility in society to make sure that's going to work for people, because we're the disruptors.
Yep.
Right. In the whole picture. Whereas a lot of the people that are doing it for more political reasons, I feel like, certainly not all of them, but some of them I think are doing it very much for the purpose of being disruptors. And that's where I think the transsexuals and the transgenders are really butting heads right now.
Yeah.
Some of us just want to do this, in order to improve our mental health and to integrate into society and live successfully into society, not to disrupt it. And then we got the transgender people that are actively trying to disrupt. And I feel like that their agenda is actually making it harder and harder and harder for me to integrate into society, because when you disrupt society, you are going to upset people and they are going to push back. And so in my life, and I do live in a more small town conservative world, the more that the disruptors are disrupting, the more angry people are getting, and I'm starting to feel more and more of that pushback, right? There's more transphobia, more people are talking out about how much they dislike the trans community, because that's all they're seeing is what you're constantly trying to disrupt my culture, destroy my culture, destroy our families. And
Yep. Yeah, there is that that pushback on the other side of it. And also, we can get to this later. There's this actually leads well into the next question. So
so why don't we, do you want to just dive right into that then? So next question, what are your thoughts on some current attempts by new orgs to separate the T from LGBT?
And I think, exactly. It bleeds right into it, because what I was following up with you is like that pushback that we're seeing as just transsexual people who want to integrate and live as the opposite sex, now getting that pushback as a result of the more extreme disruptors, as you say, of the trans community. That's now also falling into the LGB camp as well, because the T is, as I would say it, kind of tacked on there at the end, and it becomes this idea of a singular community. Personally, I think the T shouldn't just be separated from LGB because it is causing a harm to the two of the three letters that come before it socially, but also because I don't think that there is the connection there that people externally seem to believe that there is. Being sexually attracted to the opposite sex is a very different thing. Or excuse me, being sexually attracted to the same sex is a very different thing than wanting to medically transition to be the opposite sex. These are two distinct things. Often the motivation behind is, does overlap, right? To being, as we talked about before, being extremely gay in such a way that blending in as the opposite sex is much more comfortable to your life. So there is that overlap there, but now that connection seems to be completely out the window, as the T does seem to take on more and more of the Q role of just disrupting all that is sex, and that legal distinction. So those are three reasons I want them separated. Or was that two? Either way, my primary reason is I think including the T in LGB is part of what's enabling, it might be the majority of what is enabling this what I see as like a dangerous fad religion of transition. If you include the T with just these other really, really harmless sexual orientations. But the T, however, in most cases involves irreversible, invasive alterations to one's body. And so a lot of, with the rainbow being splattered everywhere and everything cis and straight being so uncool and everything queer being so cool, a lot of people are opting into the T of that acronym as admission into the cool club. And I think it's very, very dangerous. And so mainly for young people trying to work their way into the cool rainbow club, that's why I see that the majority of the reason why the T needs to be extricated from the rest, because the others you can dabble in. You think you might be gay or lesbian or bisexual, you can maybe have some awkward experiences, be like, nope, never mind, that wasn't for me. But the T you can't undo if you take that to its logical extent, and that's sorry, that's three reasons why I'm absolutely in favor of the T being removed from that acronym.
Mm-hmm. I think it was originally added to the acronym because, what I was saying earlier, for the homosexual subtype of gender dysphoria, it was and is a condition that impacts LGBT people. So, because it's like an extension of the sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. So it kind of made sense in that context.
Mm-hmm. Well, another context I think it also does make sense, sorry to interrupt here, is the autogynephilia is in a lot of ways asexual orientation. So a lot of the people who are advocating for the T to be included are of the autogynephilic subtype, but they don't want to really go into why it makes so much sense for it to be included. And the why is because it's a sexuality. Sorry, so and that's what I'm saying is like two reasons, and like so you can see it from both directions. The HSTS, AGP variety, it's like both kind of make sense, but that last one they don't want to explain why. The reason why it makes sense.
And in both cases, we're talking about a condition of some kind versus a sexual orientation, and the whole project of queer theory has been this belief that any distinctions, any sort of boundaries and distinctions as groups of people is something to be feared and dismantled, right? That any of these categories and distinctions they see as prisons we live in, for the purpose of oppressing us. And so by blurring all those boundaries, right, like confusing us as to what is straight and what is gay, or what is male and what is female, and blurring those boundaries. So now we have, basically heterosexual people in the queer community because they're demisexuals or whatever, and so I think what the LGBT community is waking up to is, well, actually these distinctions, these categories and distinctions also protected us. Like, it allowed us to advocate for ourselves and our unique experiences. And so I think what the LGBT community is saying is, we no longer are allowed to have our own spaces. We're no longer allowed to advocate just for people with, a same-sex sexual orientation, or women saying, well, what about our rights? What about our health? What about our unique biological needs? So there is this desire from various communities to say, well, actually, we want these boundaries back because they were serving a protective purpose for us, not just an oppressive purpose. And I don't know how we make that shift in thinking from this total distrust of everything category, because it just creates a whole new category. Like, we never really escape any categorization. As you were saying earlier, like, we've just created a new binary, right? We just created like a trans cis binary. Okay, well, now that's a new categorization system, right? So
yeah, and it's an entirely meaningless one as well, just because trans means anything at this point. And but then going back to the T as well in the LGB is what a lot of people external to the community don't see as, I use that word, I wish I used it ironically, but I didn't. I used it unironically. But external don't see that the T in most ways completely undermines the rest of the LGBs kind of an entire basis for being, right? So if you're saying that a male is now female because they identify as a lesbian, that's completely undermining what it even means to be a lesbian. So in that way, it's and in the opposite way as well is like you got a lot of these female to male transitioners in the in the genderqueer trans identified camp who are heterosexual attracted to men, but they're now insisting that they are gay men and they belong in gay men's spaces. And any gay man who's like, well, that's not really that undermines the purpose of this space is then a transphobe and a bigot. And obviously we see this much more on the lesbian side of that coin is trans women taking over lesbian spaces, because again, the vast majority of them are heterosexual males, and people outside don't see that's what the L and B or L and G are confronted with right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and organizations like the LGBT Alliance are very clearly saying, like, it's not that we want harm to be done to trans people. It's not that we want, your rights taken away. It's just that our needs are unique in some in many ways from yours. So we want to create organizations that are advocating and looking for the needs of us as same-sex attracted people. And we're afraid to continue advocating for our own rights separate from gay and lesbian people, right? So I don't feel people are reactionary and see these organizations as transphobic, and I don't see it that way. People are allowed to speak for their own needs, their own unique needs, and they have needs that are different than ours.
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's like how they frame it is how the activists are framing it is a male and female binary is that oppressive binary that you were talking about, whereas a cis trans binary is the appropriate, the moral, the progressive binary that we should all now live in. And so when people are trying to live in a sex binary of male and female, a real tangible physical reality versus this kind of constructed, meaningless, nebulous cis trans binary, well, anybody who doesn't accept this one is acting out of bigotry and transphobia. And so that's how they're able to classify the LGBT Alliance in that classification, is because they're seeing life as it really is. They're seeing material reality of male and female, and same-sex attraction obviously is dependent on that that real binary. And then so that seems to be the case by and large. It's like anybody who doesn't accept the true real binary of the cis trans is obviously just acting out of bigotry and transphobia, and is therefore a hate group and must be silenced.
And people are kidding themselves if they think that that's going to be tolerated in the long term, right? Like, because it's not based in material reality. Yeah.
Yep. Moving on.
Yeah, the next one's a really interesting question too. So, do you feel that feminism applies or should apply to you?
Personally, no. I can see that. I can see why. I can see why it would. I mean, I'm female. Feminism applies to people who are female sexed, but I don't exist in the world as a female. I'm not a victim of misogyny or discrimination or I feel like when I transitioned, I entirely inherited, maybe not entirely, but for all intents and purposes, inherited male privilege, something that I didn't really see as existing until I had it. It's very clear the distinction when you pass and live in society as a man versus as a woman. So in that regard, no, I don't feel that feminism does apply to me. I can understand any trans man having a very different answer to that question, but I think that's my kind of simple answer to that one.
I agree with what you're saying, that it does seem like we've kind of opted out of opted out of being allowed to speak on behalf of women, because we're not living our life as female anymore, right? So we don't face the same things that women do anymore. I mean, I still value feminist principles though, and I would still say that I try to think about and live by some of those principles, but I don't feel like I have any real stance or say within feminist circles anymore. I think where I'm finding myself engaging with feminist ideas more is just the unpacking of my own dysphoria and and my concerns by how many young girls, especially young lesbians, are now transitioning. It seems helpful and inevitable to use some feminist analysis in looking at the whole trans debate, but whether that means I'm still allowed to call myself a feminist, that part's debatable.
Yep, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, so the next question, I'm hearing some who have transitioned bring more subtlety into it than just the dichotomy that there's a true range or spectrum of experience more than just transitioned or detransitioned. So yeah, because there is this, it's tricky with this language, and we've talked a little bit about, how those words themselves are in some ways misleading. This idea of transitioned, for example. I mean, what does that? It almost implies that we truly are changing sex, like we're transitioning from one thing to another thing.
Yep. And we because there was a follow-up question by somebody else entirely that we kind of tacked on here that basically it's almost like that question was answered by the second question here. It seems to me that by using phrases like transition, which I respectfully believe is misleading because it implies a change of sex, we have created a new binary: transition versus detransitioned. I think I would entirely agree with that. Is that transitioning it is like we were talking about a legal fiction, right? Like so it is like the bridge to a legal fiction is this concept of transitioning from one sex to another, and that and then so on the flip side of that, you have people who detransition, the implication being that they have changed back from one sex to their natal sex. In reality, none of the above has actually happened. It's like you've altered your body in some way to appear as the opposite sex, and then you want to take steps to undo that process to whatever degree that's possible. But your sex has never changed. Some cosmetic or sometimes surgical, let's say cosmetic alterations have been made to your body. But yeah, your sex has never changed. So I agree. It is a false dichotomy. I think it exists to be a false dichotomy, to be to prop up that legal fiction of you've transitioned to the opposite sex. And I think not only is that misleading, but I think maybe in doing away with that dichotomy, we can kind of support detransitioners in a lot of ways by pointing out that that I don't want to tell detransitioners how to think about their experiences, but you know what I mean. Like it's kind of it's like you. Yeah, there's nothing really to detransition from, other than to undo what's been done, wherever possible or however possible. Again, I might be overstepping here, but
yeah, and I'm not. I agree with you, and I wouldn't say I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but I don't know what word we could put in the place of transition that would be less misleading. Like if we're going to continue, providing this treatment for people with gender dysphoria, I mean, I don't know what we call that isn't going to be equally troubling. But I think when we talked to James Shoup about his journey, he really highlighted this, right? Because he went from male to female to non-binary back to male, and but it's still the same person, right? So
yeah,
I can't remember exactly how we worded that, but it was just so beautiful and
it put me in mind of like,
right?
You're standing still and this kind of process is happening around you is what it put me in mind of. And it was very, very well put. And that made me see it in a lot of the ways that I'm now talking about it as well.
Yeah.
But I agree with you as well. As I haven't followed that through to the logical conclusion of what terminology do we use instead.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I can't think of a single word that would kind of work that doesn't have just the same problems, like, because the treatment masculinized my appearance, right? But I'm still the same person. It's not like I transitioned into this completely different persona. Like I still act the same. I still almost look the same. I mean, I've got a beard now. That's probably the biggest difference. So it's for me, it wasn't this like completely reinvention of self and I'm this whole new person. I was really, what I was seeking in in this treatment was just to improve my mental health and be able to function and achieve my life goals. And the dysphoria at that time was really having a big impact on my functioning.
Yep. Same. My thing is, I never. So it's same thing as I understood I would always be female, and that I could masculinize, cosmetically masculinize my body in a certain way to appear externally, but more importantly, to relieve this very extreme internal discomfort I had with my body, and it worked wonders in doing that. I did take a lot of comfort in the world perceiving me as male. And I still do to a large degree, but now where I'm at is ethically what that means. I don't mean, because again, there is this legal fiction that we are perpetuating, which I see as harmless for most intents and purposes, and does more good than harm in most cases. We're just getting into shaky territories with what we discussed earlier, but I think I'm getting into a different topic. So I don't know if you want to move to the.
Sure. There was just one other thing I wanted to say about those words, transition versus detransitioned, is within, like, because you're right that it creates that binary. But I've been struggling to find a word to describe the experience of, how do I put it, of regretting at least some part of the transition, but not detransitioning. We don't really have a word for that, which I think the question is, I think that's part of what this question is trying to ask is, right, is that there is a gray area between those two things, even if we don't dissect what those words mean, right? If we just take those words at face value, there's people that transition, by taking these treatments, and there's people that completely change their mind and undo that. But there is this whole gray area. I mean, there are people who detransition who still have gender dysphoria, or there are people that don't plan, like myself. I don't plan to detransition. I think that would be too disruptive to my life at this point. And even to say regret is too strong a word in my case. It's just that I've worked my way out of a lot of the distress I was feeling because of my dysphoria, and transition, that medicalizing my body did help relieve that distress. But over the last 15 years, I've also worked at this and thought about this and done some of my internal work to the point where I feel like my mental health is at a point where it wouldn't have been necessary for me to transition if I had achieved the mental health and clarity that I have now. So that's different than regret. But but I think a lot of trans people do regret parts of their transition. Like maybe they're happy with the hormones, but they regret a certain surgery that didn't go the way expected. Or so there are all these other narratives that are kind of hidden in that language of there's this transition and detransition, and everyone that doesn't detransition is happy with their transition, and I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that narrative is well captured in any of the research or surveys, because they're kind of doing this research based on this idea that if you're not detransitioning, then it must mean you're happy with your transition. And they're not wording the questions in a way that's going to draw out some of that richer material. Yep.
That's a very good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, that is that new dichotomy of transition versus detransition. It disguises so much. So a wide array of experiences. Underneath there. And I mean, maybe as people keep having more and more of these conversations, being more honest and open about what dysphoria and transition and certain elements of regret feel like, we can kind of people can kind of understand better within themselves what that means, or what steps to take, or how to talk about it.
And the root of this problem seems to be, going back to this idea that there is such a thing as a trans person, right? Rather than an experience of gender dysphoria, that how can you transition and detransition from being this trans person that's somehow innate to your being, right? So detransitioners tend to get accused of, well, you never really were trans, right? You never actually had gender dysphoria. But if if we reframe our thinking of this and think of it, this is an experience called gender dysphoria that some people can acquire, some people can recover from, some people who detransition still have gender dysphoria, but they decided that the medicalization just wasn't for them for some reason, so they seek to manage their dysphoria in other ways. So when we think of it as gender dysphoria, this idea of transition and detransition makes sense, right? That they can swing, from transition to detransition and everything in between quite seamlessly, because we're all just trying to manage an inner state of distress. Right? It's not a state of solid personhood.
Yep. Is another reason why that whole trans cis binary is so incredibly harmful.
Yeah. Okay, next question is, I'd be interested to hear what people with GD wish it was called sex dysphoria. I agree with that. Would be clearer. Think are the kind of legal social rights or accommodations that would be helpful without crossing into sex self-ID?
Such a tough question.
Because in some countries, they don't allow you to legally change sex until you've medically transitioned, right? Because I think that's like in the UK, don't they have some sort of like document that?
The gender recognition certificate, GRC.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what all is required in that. I think it used to be the case that people had to have complete SRS, right, in order to qualify as the opposite sex, which I have mixed feelings about. I'm gonna now fully land on the case that I think that's inappropriate, just because it encourages people to have encourages people to have really invasive surgeries that oftentimes are quite experimental and can be quite loaded with complications and whatnot. And so I can see the on one hand, yes, this means you're actually serious and you do intend to live and function as the opposite sex, but just with how dangerous those surgeries are, I don't kind of putting mentally vulnerable people, shoveling them in a direction where they feel like they have to go that route is probably not a good idea.
It's a really tricky ethical question, isn't it? Like, because I know that the trans activist side of things is so much about bodily autonomy, and that nobody should be, force us to have this surgery or this surgery or this intervention or this intervention. And yet, if we take away any requirement in order to legally change sex, then we are left with the self-ID question, right? That anyone can just declare that they are the opposite sex, and everyone is somehow supposed to adjust and adjust pronouns, and even though we don't have any visual cues. And so I don't know what the answer to that is exactly. I definitely agree with you, like a hard line with like the genital surgeries, because they're, having been through them, they're so awful and the complication rates are so high. I don't think it should be a requirement that we force people to undergo a procedure that is a pretty shitty procedure, right? It's too high risk. But I do feel like there should be some requirement, like, that some commitment and some requirement that prior to you receiving legal recognition as the opposite sex, that there needs to be something beyond just a self-declaration.
Yeah. I know in my state, all it required was a self-declaration. Well, not a self-declaration. I had a letter from my doctor that was saying that I think it was that I was diagnosed with transsexualism was what it was, and that enabled me to have an M on my state ID. But I remember I don't even know if I had been on. I certainly hadn't had any surgery at that point. I think I may have been on hormones for a month or two. I certainly wasn't visibly read as male when I was legally designated as such. I think maybe half the time I kind of passed as it, but that's not really a good guiding post. But yeah, I don't, just going from personal experience, I don't know what that should be. I mean, in most cases of male to female transition, hormones alone are not going to visually change somebody from being perceived as male, and yet still being, because obviously it's the case in at least my state. I think every state. I don't think you can discriminate on that level of male versus female transition, but it is kind of understood that it's easier for female to male transitioners, once you're on hormones for a matter of months, to kind of be read as the opposite sex, where it isn't as easily the case in the male to female direction. So that's why I hesitate to say, okay, hormones for a certain matter of months is what should designate one, because so much of it is how we're being perceived societally, and what situations and places we put ourselves in based on that legal sex designation, could be quite disruptive to the other people in those spaces based on what they're perceiving. Again, so many reasons why this is it's a good question, but I just
it's an excellent question, and I totally agree with everything you've said, and yet for everything, because I could have said all the same things, but for every one of those points, I can kind of think of a reason why that's potentially ethically complicated as well, right? So I don't know exactly what the answer is. I'm glad I'm not in the position to be writing this policy right on the spot here, because it is hard, and we do need to balance, basic human rights. We shouldn't be forcing people to do anything with their bodies, and yet there are obvious problems with just self-ID as well. To grant people legal recognition as the opposite sex just because they say so, there's so much room for people to abuse that as well. So I don't know. It's a really, and the question of like, do we make rules based on whether someone passes or not, right? Like that's a dichotomy of, well, you look female, so we'll give you legal recognition as female, but people can't control that. We can't control how these interventions change our bodies or not. That's genetic too, and some people can't go on hormones for various health reasons, but they might still have very severe gender dysphoria, and it's complicated.
Incredible,
So I hope whoever asked this question wasn't hoping that we had a perfect answer for that, because because I don't.
No way.
Is there a way to distinguish between having gender dysphoria and being trans as an identity? Is it offensive or beneficial to frame the conversation as to how psychologically, medically treat gender dysphoria instead of affirming an identity? Well, I think that was the goal of the hormone readiness assessment once upon a time. I mean, I think that's maybe less the case now with the informed consent model. I don't think clinicians are necessarily looking for that distinction anymore. But that used to be the whole point of the hormone readiness assessment, was to make the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, right? And that this was then a treatment for gender dysphoria. And I think in the trans community, and this isn't new, I think this is a growing problem over the last 20 years, but 20 years ago, there were still people that transitioned for social and political reasons. So I wouldn't say that's entirely new.
Right.
And I think the challenge that clinicians were having was, even when they took the time to do an assessment, people lied, right? Like people would lie, people would talk to other trans people and kind of learn the script, and we were just kind of coached to say certain things in order to pass the assessment. So I wonder to what extent that the informed consent model, and I'm talking completely off the top of my head here, but to what extent is the informed consent model also about clinicians just saying, like, if people are just going to lie to us anyway, like, like, I can't control that, right? Like, if someone tells me everything I want to hear in order to get this, like, I don't have a lie detector test. Like, I can't tell who's lying and who isn't. So I guess I just, unless there's something really obviously dangerous or wrong here, right? They're floridly psychotic or something, then I guess I'll just pass them all along then, because what else am I supposed to do?
Yeah. Clinicians are put in an impossible situation right now. It's interesting that this has been, like you say, has been going on for over 20 years is kind of inter-community kind of coaching on how to answer these questions to ensure you get the transition services you want. Now with message boards, I mean, they were existed back then, online message boards for this stuff, but the proliferation now is, you got 15, 16, 17-year-olds just, watching YouTube videos on how to get access to this, reading, bullet pointed Reddit posts, and you can't interrupt it, you can't challenge it, you can't, because that's conversion therapy and yada yada. But I think with that, I think part of what this question is also asking is, do we think that there is a difference between having gender dysphoria and being trans? And I think you were also answering that in that the two are so conflated. And I think we also kind of touched on this in an earlier question as well, is that I don't personally believe that they are, I mean, so I can only answer personally. I know a lot of people are going to answer this question differently. Certainly the I identify as trans camp, but I don't think that there is, well, I think there is a distinction in that having gender dysphoria does not mean one is trans, and that a lot of people now today are claiming to be trans without having gender dysphoria, even not even just lying about having gender dysphoria. They outright say they don't have gender dysphoria, and having it is not necessary in order to be trans. Definitely two distinct things at this point. I used to be of that kind of true scum variety that, in order to be trans, you have to have gender dysphoria. But I think that's nonsense, because obviously for many years, people have been transitioning without having gender dysphoria. And those people are very much trans in that they have medically altered their bodies in the direction of the opposite sex. Again, if we're still going to use that terminology, But then on the other side, flip side of that, of course, is having gender dysphoria does not mean that you are trans. We speak to people all the time with gender dysphoria who do not transition and who don't seek to transition. And I think part of that question was, is there a way to make is there a way to distinguish between having gender dysphoria, the condition of gender dysphoria, versus an identity? I can't help but look at that from a clinician point of view, right? That's where my mind automatically goes. So if I had a young person, and I used to have young people in front of me, right? And I'm trying to make it that distinction. Like, are they just doing this to fit into a social group, or are they doing this for political reasons, or do they seem to have gender dysphoria? Sometimes that was easier to tell than others. And there were ways that I would try to ask questions, to try to draw some of that out in a way that someone couldn't just memorize a script for me. And one of the ways that, it was a lot easier to do that assessment. It's easier to do that assessment with young people. Because if you're working with someone young enough that they haven't really formed an identity around it yet, it's just an experience. They come kind of confused and have this experience of gender dysphoria, it's so much easier to access that, right? And to work with that young person and to talk about that. And I would ask questions about, like things like their Halloween costumes, or their imaginary play as children, and just really draw out their narrative of what they were like as children and what they were struggling with and how they were making sense of that experience. But if they came to me having already learned a lot of the queer theory and, like the political rhetoric of trans identity, because there can be people that buy into that politics and that culture who do have legitimate gender dysphoria too. So that makes it really hard to make a distinction. It's not either or. It's not like you have gender dysphoria with no political rhetoric and those with political rhetoric with no gender dysphoria. Sometimes those two things exist simultaneously. Absolutely.
So that made it so much harder. It was so much easier to do the assessment if they hadn't really had much contact with the trans community and hadn't learned the political language yet. So you could just have a conversation about them and their experience and what this was like for them. So I always tried to peel away that layer of just everything they learned about being trans from the internet or the community, to kind of peel that back and it's like, okay, what was this experience really like for you before you adopted the politics.
Right.
But it's a little bit like, you can't see the wind, but you can see the impact of the wind. And that's one thing that I was picking up with some of these kids is there isn't a blood test or a brain scan I can do that would prove that they have gender dysphoria. But I could, with some of the kids, see the impact of the gender dysphoria on their emotional health and their mental health and their social health. So so the question that is like, is gender dysphoria the only thing that could have caused those symptoms? And it can be really hard, I think, to distinguish between the impact of gender dysphoria and autism, for example, because for me, there are probably times, probably even still, where I seem a bit autistic, but I think that has steadily improved once I transitioned in my case. So there are people that I think have autism as a primary diagnosis, and because they don't pick up on social cues, or they may be socially isolated because of the autism, sometimes buy into a trans identity because it solves a problem for them. Either they misunderstood what they were experiencing. I mean, there's someone in our network that had that experience where she was struggling socially, wasn't picking up on social cues, thought maybe that was because she was trans, and then transitioned, and then was diagnosed with autism and realized, oh, well, that better explains what I was experiencing, right? I'm not trans after all, that this was actually my autism. So there's that concern, right? That are we actually transitioning a whole bunch of autistic kids? But I do think for people that aren't autistic and just have gender dysphoria, it can look very similar, because when I was a kid with gender dysphoria, it was a very confusing experience, and it was a very social thing for me. And we've talked about this a little bit. Like for females, it tends to be more social, not sexually motivated, and it was impairing my ability to socialize, because it felt so painful for me that it worked okay for me as a little kid, because there's not a lot of differences between boys and girls when we're children, and as a tomboy, that's somewhat socially acceptable, and so I had lots of friends and I was functioning socially. But as I became older and once puberty hit, it became really socially complicated. I became a lot more socially withdrawn, and social skills are skills, right? If we're not using those skills, we lose them, and that can start to look a lot like autism when we become a lot more withdrawn and stuck in our heads. And the experience of dysphoria it can be a very dissociative kind of experience. If we're dissociating from our bodies and not connecting to the world. I did feel very stuck in my head, which could look a lot like autism. So
I had the exact same experience. Yeah,
it could be really hard to. So when I transitioned,
because it's chicken egg.
Yeah, because for me, I do think it was rooted in the dysphoria as the primary problem. It did get better once I transitioned. I feel like people see me the way I want to interact with the world, and so I'm developing social skills.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. And one question I have around this is it because our kind of ASD tech ways of interacting are much more socially acceptable in males than in females? Like I know, for example, that that hyperfixation, the obsessive compulsive kind of and kind of mental isolation and things that I did when the world perceived me as female, even well into adulthood, that all stopped, and I live much more externally now that I present as male. And I wonder how much of that is a relief from dysphoria. I know it feels certainly like entirely a relief from dysphoria, but I also wonder how much of my way of engaging with the world, because autism is so much easily diagnosed, and maybe I'm going in the wrong direction here, and I could be contradicting myself. But I think females who are more idiosyncratic and really objective and really not really socially fluent in the ways that females are supposed to be or typically are, it can feel much more comfortable to live as a man. It seems to suit us better. I wonder if there's some validity in that, as well as just the relief from the bodily and social dysphoria, is that our personality types just feel more comfortable being read as male versus female, because we kind of feel like a square peg situation when trying to exist being read as female.
That could be. That's a good point. Yeah. That if people are expecting something different from us now, that we appear as male, because I do have a certain concreteness in my thinking, and I'm not as social and verbal as we tend to expect women and to be, and so that could be a part of it for sure.
Yeah,
it's a good point.
May have tapped into something here.
Yeah. It's, like you said, it's hard to say like the whole chicken and the egg thing too, right. But I mean, my dysphoria got to a point where I felt like my internal world was just so different from the external world, and how I would look in the mirror and how I would expect myself to look in the mirror. There was such a mismatch that it felt almost physically painful to be seen by anybody, right? Like, because it's like, so I became more and more withdrawn, because I could tell, like, so it was a sense of, I didn't even necessarily have words for it, but it felt like, I don't want you to see me because you're not seeing me, was sort of how I felt, right? And so it's like, no, I'm just going to disappear into my own world here, because you know, there was such a split between my internal world in my head and the external world.
I had for me, it wasn't painful to be externally perceived, but I did do the same thing. But for me, it was more like I just pretended everybody saw me the way I saw myself, until there was something that came in direct conflict with that, and then it was what we would say a dysphoria trigger, where it was very clear that I was being perceived as a woman, and that just felt so foreign to me. And so I lived my life mostly pretending people saw me the way that I was. The way that I saw myself. Mirrors, on the other hand, I just avoided like the plague. Like I could not look at myself. Like when I looked at myself in the mirror, that was like that being confronted with what other people saw is when I looked in the mirror. And so I avoided mirrors entirely. And then I transitioned and became incredibly vain. so that switched.
Well, it's such a relief. Like I used to hate buying clothes. I used to hate how clothing felt on my body. So is it vanity? I mean, for me, it was just such a relief to not feel that distress. It probably did look a lot like vanity and self-obsession, but for me, it was just such a relief. It's like, yes, I can, I can wear clothes, and I can get excited about going and buying clothes, and
not dread it. Yeah.
Yeah. So my wife kind of teases me, that I have more clothes than she does, which isn't actually true, but I do have more shoes than she has. But it's not vanity. It's not like I love clothes and I want to, look a certain flashy sort of way. It's just such a novelty, right? It's like, you don't understand like that it's such a relief to buy clothes now, when for like 30 years of my life I hated everything about clothing. So
it almost feels very much like making up for lost time to me. It's like you're overcompensating, or not overcompensating, but making up for lost time, like kind of extracting joy in the external world that you kind of avoided before.
I had a thought and then I lost it. I was going to pick up on a thread of something you said, and maybe it'll come back to me a little bit later.
Okay.
Oh, I did want to ask you, I remembered, because you were saying that it was painful to look at yourself in the mirror. Are you able to look back at old photos of yourself prior to transition? Is that comfortable for you?
It started to be about 3 or 4 years ago. I became very comfortable with that. There was a long time where I avoided old pictures of me. It was very, again, the only way to say it is dysphoria triggering to look at pictures of old me. But now I look at those pictures and a sense of endearment, like it's far enough away that it doesn't like I don't think like I shouldn't look like that, like I used to when I would see those pictures, and like when I would look in the mirror. But now I'm with old self, and in certain ways, there's even a sense of nostalgia. Like I should have. I mean, I don't know when to sound vain again, but it's like of me, and I was like active. Like at the time, obviously, I just saw grotesque. I saw something that shouldn't be. But so in conflict with my reflection. But now I'm so far removed from that internal feeling of conflict that I just have a sense of kind of endearment. I don't know how to explain this so much. It's a weird experience. But I definitely don't. Yeah, the last few years, those pictures don't inspire any feeling of dysphoria or distress in me. In fact, kind of the opposite. Maybe is nostalgia, like, and that's where I come now with like the same experience you're talking about. Is like, had I had the mental tools I have now, like, this is going in a deep direction I hadn't quite anticipated, actually. kind of the purpose of the podcast, though, right? But yeah, so I do. It's like, yeah, if I could look at myself the way I look at myself now, then transition wouldn't have been necessary. But was transition necessary in order for me to perceive myself that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And my experience is similar, that there used to be, I couldn't look at photos of myself. But over the years, that's gotten easier. And endearment is a good word. I like that. I like that word. Like, I'm able to look at those old photos and feel some compassion for that person. I still feel a little bit distant from that person, but for whatever reason, that distance no longer feels like an unhealthy thing. It feels like a healthy thing in some way that I don't know if I can quite articulate it, but I'm able to look at those pictures, and I mean, I recognize that it's me, and I'm able to look at them with endearment and just compassion, because some of those photos, I look really awkward, and I know what that awkwardness meant. Like, I know that it that was the dysphoria, and that I was suffering, and I'm able to feel, rather than just look at those photos and feel immediately kind of repulsed. Like, it was a very visceral, like, response I used to have, right? Where it's like, just so distressed and so repulsed. It's not that I thought that I looked ugly or disfigured or something, but it had wrong. This very wrong. This lack of body ownership. Like, no, that's not me, and that's not what I look like. But I am able to look at those photos now, and it did make a difference. I don't know if this was your experience, but when I started to accept the fact that I am biologically female, and that that's never going away, and that this is a treatment for gender dysphoria, and I've masculinized, but I'm still female. When I was able to really accept that, it integrated parts of me, right? I'm no longer rejecting a big part of my own story and my own reality. And I felt like that's when I really started to turn a corner and be able to look at those pictures and not have that same kind of recoiling reaction, right?
Yep, exactly, same. And I wonder, just going back to a little bit what you said before, is why is it that that person, is like, if you got a sense of endearment, but that person does feel so distinct from you, like a kind of a distance. And I wonder, we have an interesting perspective in that our kind of brain chemistry has changed along the way too. So I don't know with cross-sex hormones, right? Because it impacts your psychology quite a bit. And so I do wonder how much of looking back and feeling like that was a different person. Like, you remember being that person, but it does feel like an entirely different person to you now. And so I do wonder how much of that is age, just normal growing up, aging, and how much of it is, that we have altered our psychology in a way that most people haven't altered their psychology as they age. And so there's a lot of experiences that I had, or just the way that I thought, just kind of cognitively functioned, emotionally and whatnot, that's very different than how I am now. And I don't think most of that is age. I think most of that is male levels of testosterone that's kind of impacted a lot of the way I perceive the world and myself and stuff. And so I do think we have a unique experience in that. I think a lot of it probably is just distance from age. But I think there is, like, the reason that person might feel a little bit more distant than even just, any other person 10 years, 15 years previously, is I do think that there's an element of our psychology has, in fact, changed fairly profoundly. Yeah,
that's a good point, because it's just, you're right, that the testosterone isn't just a clever, just external disguise. That it does impact our brains and our emotions. Like, I'm not able to cry anymore on testosterone, like all the so I have to learn to manage my emotions in other ways. And
it's so funny too, because I'm entirely the opposite. I know I'm a total outlier in this, because I was never a crier before. I had a range of emotion and whatnot. but I feel like I'm much more sentimental now. This is the second episode of this podcast I've started to cry during, because it's like things that are just kind of nostalgia or sentimental, or like they just like my tear ducts just, and it started happening just a few months on testosterone, which is completely counter to most people. So I can be watching a commercial that's sentimental and I'll start crying. I took my niece to see this movie that was like the most cheesy piece of crap I've ever witnessed, but every time this dumb dog died, I would start like so my 9-year-old niece is sitting next to me like, you're embarrassing, but,
well, yeah, it's funny you say that, because yes, now that you're saying that, I agree. So I guess I need to explain a little better what I mean, because yeah, you're absolutely right. As far as like sentimental things, like watching a sentimental movie or something, like something that touches sort of my heart, you know, in a sentimental sort of way, or really sweet sort of way. Like I remember early in my transition going and watching Super Dogs, a Super Dog show, and the dogs were so cute, and I was crying. So you're right. Like for sentimental things, I cry a lot more easily, but out of like frustration or sadness, or then
that's so true.
Those things I don't tend to cry.
Things that are deep, like my dad died, and it took me, I think, 2 days to actually cry. You know, like, and we were very close. But like things that are very, very deep and profound and terribly sad. Those I don't respond. Yeah, it's just sentimental things. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Look forward to our talk coming up about testosterone and the impacts of testosterone.
Yeah.
A little teaser for people here.
Yep.
We're almost at the end of our questions. So,
okay.
As passing trans men, how has your advocacy affected your personal and professional lives?
I'll answer this. Mine's kind of a quick answer, in that yours is probably going to be a lot more. You've had a lot more to deal with in this regard. But for me, all of my advocacy has taken place within the confines of COVID. So I was basically, I mean, I lived stealth for a long time, but kind of came out via Facebook, therefore, to new friends and colleagues who hadn't previously known, in around 2018. I want to say, and people got a little bit awkward around me at first, and then things just kind of went back to normal. And but then in regards to, so I gave up that whole pass. I mean, obviously I still pass, but I've no longer lived entirely stealth as I used to. But with regards to making myself kind of public in this regard with Gender Dysphoria Alliance and this podcast and whatnot, or even when I started getting much more outspoken on Twitter about 1.5 years ago, it's all been done within this kind of social bubble of COVID. So I haven't really been out living my real life. It's all, so I have yet to see what that might feel like. For example, my boss started listening to this podcast, so which is really kind of sweet, but also really kind of, it's just when I think about things like that, it's very a very sense of weird kind of vulnerability and exposure that that I hadn't really maybe thought fully through. I mean, I definitely have no regrets with this kind of exposure and this kind of activism, but yeah, time will tell, you know, if life goes back to normal, when life goes back to normal, what that feels like in a day-to-day. But as far as like external pushback or anything like that, I haven't had to deal with any of that. So time remains to be told. But
yeah, I'm curious about the word passing in this question. You know, like, because I mean, what difference would it make in this discussion if we weren't passing? So I'm trying to think of what might be the intention there of highlighting the word passing in the question, right? Like, right. And one of the ways I'd like to answer that question is, you know, because you mentioned that you were living stealth before. So one of the ways I wanted to answer this question is, because we were passing and I was living stealth as well, is that it would be easy for us to just kind of ignore that all of this is happening and just go and live our lives as we have been, and and not even think about the trans question anymore, right? Which is what I was trying to do. I received the treatment. The treatment was helpful for me. I've just been trying to live my life. And so I wonder if this could be a question of why would we risk that, right? Why, if we could just live stealth and just disappear into the world as men, why would we risk coming out and saying what we're saying if we didn't have to? How would you answer that?
Okay. In that case, this is a very good question in that regard, because I think the answer is there's twofold for me. Is that one, I see the damage that's being done, and I feel like I have the capacity to talk about it and to kind of get in I don't want to feel like this kind of Superman thing, but I feel like there's almost like a moral duty to talk about it, to come forward and to talk about this stuff, to draw attention to it, because I do really feel like immense harm is being done, is being perpetuated in the name of trans and transition. And I think it's a matter of years, a handful of years, before that damage is shown for what it is. And I couldn't live with myself if I just sort of, ducked my head and ignored it all. For what I see again is the remaining maybe 5, 10. Yeah, I can't even imagine it lasting that much longer. But just a matter of years, we're going to see the full extent of the harm that's being done to mostly young women and teenage girls. And the more I can talk about it and draw attention to it, I think as trans adults who've been through this, even who have a positive experience with it for maybe even just 60-70% positive, like we have I don't want to say a duty. I feel like it's a duty, but I don't want to put that on anybody else. But yeah, I guess that's why I do it. Is I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Again, I just mean that very personally. I know other people have very different ways of dealing with this, yeah.
I agree with you that it kind of feels like we're all on a bus and we can see that it's headed for a cliff, right?
Yep.
And what is our responsibility? We were talking earlier about society has granted us the privilege of being able to do this so that we could feel some relief from our dysphoria, but what is our responsibility, right, in that, and in how we wield that kind of this tool that's been given to us. So that's where I'm coming from. Is I do feel a sense of responsibility. And we're older and we've been doing this for a while, so we have a little more sort of historical perspective on this. I don't want to leave it to the kids to have to sort all of this out, because they're not going to have all the same tools and the perspective that we have as older adults. And I agree that I think a lot of harm is being done, and it's just a matter of years. My best guess would be a handful of years as well. So I don't see how I could live with myself either, to just ignore that that's happening and let people be damaged to that. I actually wish we could do this faster than we are, right? I have to pace myself. There's only so much that I as an individual can do, but I do feel a sense of responsibility to try to do something to slow it down, just so that fewer people are harmed.
Yep.
Yeah. And I hope, the fact that we're passing as men, it's interesting to see how that plays out, when we're talking about this stuff, because the language has been obscured in a way that we can't just talk about the issues as they are. I don't know how to articulate that. Like, if we're not allowed to talk about different kinds of gender dysphoria, or how trans politics are impacting gay and lesbian people or women or children, like, we can't have a really honest conversation about how all of that is playing out in society if we don't have a conversation about biological reality.
Yeah.
And when we are the ones that are drawing attention to that, we've been accused of this new kind of term, trans misogyny, because we're women, or we're men, we're passing male. So everything we say gets interpreted as you are a male saying this, you are a male criticizing trans women, therefore you're misogynist because you're men you're men attacking women. And that's probably been the most frustrating part of all of it for me. Yeah. I mean, yes, I'm passing as male because I take testosterone, but a lot of what I have to say is actually coming from my history as female and a lesbian.
Yeah. It's infuriating because we're trying to kind of interrupt what we see as medical harm that's being done, but we have to do so within this really Orwellian construct that's just absolutely maddening. Like, it makes you feel like you're actually insane when you get confronted with the ideas like that we have male privilege and we're perpetuating misogyny against heterosexual men who want to be lesbians. I'm going to start going on an angry rant, but like
it's frustrating. Having lived a great deal of my adult life as an actual lesbian,
right?
To be told that I no longer have a say in queer and trans politics because now I'm a straight man.
Yeah.
But straight men who take estrogen and want to be lesbians now have a say in all of that, right? So it is this, very, very bizarre, very surreal reality that we're living in today.
Yeah.
So I think we got one more question, and that kind of maybe leads nicely into it. So why is there not more discussion about the role that sexism plays in, I guess, these trans politics? So sexism within the homes or communities where girls want to be boys and boys want to be girls. Do you reflect on that part played by your absorbing the sexist attitudes and beliefs? I think the spirit of the question is maybe saying that the gender dysphoria is a direct result of sexism. Is that kind of is that your take on the question? And I don't know that I agree that that's always the case. I don't know that gender dysphoria, I think some people maybe do transition because of sexism and homophobia. And I've talked before about how homophobia was probably a factor in my decision to transition. But I don't know that it was a factor in the dysphoria itself.
Right. Okay. I think for me, so I used to say that absolutely not, that sexism didn't play a role, or that how it's often phrased in our direction is internalized misogyny. I used to say, no, internalized misogyny didn't play a role because I never conceptualized myself as a woman. Like, it seemed like a foreign concept. So it's like, no, I didn't feel like I was a victim of misogyny because I wasn't a woman, obviously. Very technically, I was. But so I used to say no to that question. But now when I think back, my early upbringing and my childhood years, that I think is what helped formulate this idea, this concept of myself as not a girl, as a boy or as a man as I grew up, but was based on, maybe not entirely, but I think a lot of it was based on really strict conservative notions of what men and women do, and I felt very at odds with this. So I grew up, homeschooled, reading, home ec textbooks that were basically teaching me that I was supposed to be a wife and a mother, and it was like, well, absolutely not. That's not me. I'm not going to do that. So I don't know how much of that was like this kind of sexist conservative notion of what role females play in society and in the home that I was objecting to, or that I was just objecting to it because it felt so foreign for me personally, because I was running around and playing with the boys, and I just had this. So again, chicken and egg. I don't know which came first, me rejecting that kind of construct because I felt like I was a boy, or me deciding I was a boy because I didn't like that construct I was supposed to be raised into. So I do think that maybe there is a certain element that influenced my gender dysphoria as it developed, because the concept of, so yeah, again, chicken and egg. Did I reject it because it felt so confining and so restrictive, or did I reject it because it was so out of character for me? I think this could all be examined from a rather sexist perspective, or a feminist, certainly, perspective. I don't know if that answers it kind of a weird way, but
yeah, that does make it a hard question, right? That whole chicken and an egg sort of thing. And yeah, and I've tried to reflect back on what was dysphoria like for me as like a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, and before I had an awareness about things like sexism or gender roles, or so it's hard to sort of tease those things apart and say, well, no, it wasn't a factor, or it was a factor. I don't know how to even, yeah, I don't know how I would separate those two things enough to say for certain.
And it's also interesting too, I think, because my memories of my early childhood seem to change as I grow older. So I think it's sort of a natural thing where you're kind of imprinting on your very young self, who you are now, so I don't know that it's even possible to really extract, exactly what you are thinking and doing, because I think, how I conceptualize myself as a very small child, and what I remember seems to actually alter as I get older. So I don't know that we can entirely unbiasedly remember what what was going on for us at that 3, 4, 5-year-old age.
Because there must be a reason, like with the homosexual subtype of gender dysphoria, there must be some reason why gender nonconformity, especially in gay kids, like why is that so much a part of the childhood? Like, what is it about? It's almost like a pre-sexuality in gay and lesbian children. So they're not sexual beings yet as a 3-year-old or 5-year-old, but there seems to be something developmental for us that, because we are going to grow up to be gay or lesbian, there is probably something neurologically different about our sexual orientation that is playing out when we're children that isn't necessarily a sexual orientation yet. It's sort of like a developmental stage towards the sexual orientation.
Right. Like, how much of it is so with girls being hyper, like, so it's not so much that these are born lesbian so much as these are very, very masculine girls who then, when our sexuality develops, and I'm different in this regard, but like, I wonder how much of sexuality is the result of, either in males, hyperfeminization in the womb, and thus the result is homosexuality or attraction to men, and vice versa in girls. So so it's like we keep doing this chicken and egg thing. Is like, are we talking about somebody who's a lesbian who's going to grow up to be a lesbian and therefore she's hypermasculine as a girl, or are we talking about somebody who was exposed to extremely high for a female amounts of testosterone in the womb, and therefore is going to ultimately develop a sexual attraction towards females? So is it the masculinization and the feminization that then results in same-sex attraction as you grow up?
That seems to be the case, and that'll be an interesting question when we do have our conversation next week about testosterone, because we do know that people with certain intersex conditions, like the one I had, where we do have higher than average female testosterone levels, that we are more likely to also be same-sex attracted. So at least for natal females, exposure to testosterone during fetal development does seem to be a factor in how our sexual orientation developed. That it seemed to masculinize, that testosterone in utero masculinized our brain in such a way, not that it give me a male brain, but it made me same-sex attracted.
Yeah.
And that somehow my gender dysphoria is probably somehow tied to that.
Yeah.
But when I really reflect on trying to understand my gender dysphoria, I keep coming back to this concept of cognitive categorization, which is for the most part an unconscious process. And 3-year-olds, and my earliest memories of gender dysphoria are around that time of being 3. But when we're 3, that's also the time where we're developing the ability to cognitively categorize things. And that's for the most, it's a very complex, sophisticated cognitive process when you think about even something like understanding the difference between a cat and a dog. And most 3-year-olds can point at a cat and say, there's a cat, and there's a dog. But when you really break that down, it's actually quite complicated how we arrive at that, right? I mean, because it's not like there's so many similarities between them. They're both mammals. They both have 4 legs. They both have hair. They both, right? There's big dogs and small dogs, and there's big cats and small cats. But we're still able, despite all of those similarities and differences, we're able to say, well, there's a cat and there's a dog. So we go through a similar categorization of male and female as 3-year-olds as well. So most 3-year-olds can say, well, there's a man and there's a woman. But I don't think a 3-year-old understands the difference between the sexes in the same way like a radical feminist might, right? Right. Yeah. So so we're categorizing male and female, not necessarily based on an understanding of genetics or chromosomes, like how chromosomes work or how gametes work, right? I don't think I even saw boys and girls naked when I was a 3-year-old, but I still categorized there's boys and there's girls. So it's very much I think we make those categorizations not based on genitals, not based on chromosomes. We base it largely on social and visual cues. And so it's like a gestalt, sort of the type of thinking that there's a whole bunch of little factors that go into how we made those categorizations. And I think for me, gender dysphoria was like a malfunction of that categorization process, because, and maybe that is where sexism plays into it, that growing up in a really small town where there wasn't a lot of diversity, there were much more limited sort of roles for men and for women. And so maybe my process of cognitive categorization would have been different if I was seeing much more of a range of there's lots of different kinds of women and lots of different kinds of men, because I don't remember like really knowing any gay or lesbian people or gender nonconforming people. Some farming women in small towns have a much more masculine sort of appearance of short hair and wear flannel shirts or whatever, but still there was a much more narrow range of male and female. So that could have been a factor. Yeah, for sure.
Yep. Yeah.
Good stuff. We had a handful of questions, and we thought we were going to end up having a shorter episode this time. And
I think we still came in at about an hour, an hour 30. We're going to try to aim towards more hour-long episodes, but it might not be within our capability.
Once we get going, we just we just go.
Yeah.
Well, great. These have been great questions. I'm glad we did this.
Yeah, I think it was a great conversation. Tackled a lot of material, and thank you to everybody who submitted the questions. There were a lot that were really good that we didn't get to, but yeah, thank you to everybody who did submit them. Very good content. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.